start up. I don't know that this is working yet and that there's no amplification here, despite the fact that I look like I'm from outer space. And so I can just try and speak up. I'm pleased to be here this morning. I'm Doug Otati. I teach over at Davidson College. I've been teaching there for about, give or take 15 years, something like that. Before that, I taught for pretty much a whole career at Union Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. So that's more or less what I've done. I'm pleased to be here this morning. I'm sorry that I have this little distraction on my nose. You'll all know what that is. You live long enough, you get a couple biopsies once in a while. I got a big enough nose already, and you put something else on it, and it could distract people, and I hope that won't happen. What I want to do today is start a three-part series on abortion as a moral issue, and we will try and weigh all of those terms with some care. I'm going to take a long wind-up. In the American League, sometimes when people are on base, people just pitch from the stretch and they just kind of chuck it. But if no one's on base, there's a whole big long wind-up. And I think with moral issues like this one, you're better off if you take a long wind-up and not just throw it. So that's what we're going to do. The three sessions they're marked off here on the handout that you have, or that many of you have, and some more are coming. Session 1 is abortion as a difficult moral issue, and we're going to underscore the word difficult and why that's the case. Session 2 is on some relevant theological themes and historical observations. So we'll talk about biblical and theological themes like creation, life, and other things, also respect for persons and justice. We will also there talk about some historical observations, what have been traditional practices with respect to the birth of children, etc., in different societies at different times. I think it's kind of illuminating in a way. The world does not always get more liberal in some sense. I mean, you're going to be surprised by some of the stuff there, I think. In any case, we will do that. And then I will also end in session number 3, constructing a moral stance on the issue. Now, we'll get through some things today to see how that's different from a legal policy. A legal policy would be somewhat more detailed, and you're going to have to make some choices. But a moral stance, I think, can inform a legal policy, even though it's not exactly the same thing as a legal policy. Though it would be difficult to tell that from American contemporary debates. But American contemporary debates, I don't want to tell you anything. They got one foot on a banana peel. If you're a theological ethicist, there's some problems there. All right, so let's just begin with a kind of introduction. I want to begin with a pastoral point, really. The question of abortion is, of course, deeply personal and often emotionally fraught. Pregnancy is intimate by definition. It has to do with relationships between persons and immediately and directly with the embodied lives of women, as well as their hopes, fears, expectations, and plans. Can't really abstract the issue of abortion from those things. Circumstances also vary very widely. Many pregnancies are intertwined with joyous possibilities. Some threaten a woman's physical health, some result from traumatizing acts of violence and betrayal, some require changes in life directions. And at the center of all of this is the pregnant woman, whether very young or a mature adult, weighing the possibilities, drawing on different levels of familial and communal support, estimating the medical and financial resources to which she has access, and having to make a very significant decision. Because a Christian ethic aims to care for persons, the intimate and deep existential embeddedness of the question of abortion is something we need not to lose sight of while we're proceeding, particularly in a Christian context. Consider next that current debates in this country involve competing values. We confront particular phrases and ideas, for example, our bodies, ourselves, choice, life, and now fetal personhood. Standing alone, I think, no one of these phrases is entirely adequate to the question, but each aims to articulate a deep moral value, such as life, or health, or respect for self-directing persons. The politics surrounding the question in this country and elsewhere are intense. This past Tuesday, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina proposed a national ban on abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. with exceptions for threats to the mother's life, rape, and incest. His proposal, which appeared to be an attempt to unite some Republicans around what is for many of them a comparatively more moderate stance. And there's many more radical positions being stated in that one. Did not address exceptions for fetal abnormalities, which is a feature of some other stances. That is what happens if you have information that the fetus is severely malformed. The state of New York allows abortion, for example, up to the point of, quote, fetal viability, or 22 to 24 weeks into pregnancy, with a number of exceptions thereafter. A recent Pew Research Center review of abortion laws around the world, their title, shows significant variation in tension. In 1988, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that existing abortion restrictions were unconstitutional. And since then, abortion has been legal for any reason at any stage of pregnancy. Abortion is illegal in El Salvador, in all cases, even when doctors consider it medically necessary. Many places combine choice with significant restrictions. Thus, since 1974, it has been legal in Sweden in all circumstances to have an abortion during the first 15 weeks of pregnancy, 18 weeks, excuse me, but after that, only to save the life or physical health of the mother, or if approval is granted by the National Board of Health and Welfare. Access to abortion in Mexico varies from state to state. Some allow abortion only in instances where the mother's life or health is threatened. Mexico City became the first municipality to legalize abortion or to lift restrictions within the first trimester or 12 weeks. Now, there are lots more illustrations in the Pew review. What I just want to point out is if you think we're having a little bit of a difficult time figuring this out, we are not alone. This is not peculiar. There is a world of laws that indicate there are some conflicting values involved in this question, and it's not so easy to unravel. Note once again the competing values involved: life, health, autonomy, or if you like, respect for the choices and decisions of women. Self-directing, I would prefer to say rather than autonomous, but it's a philosophical point. Okay, now a moral issue. So first thing is we've got an introduction, and we've got a little bit of a tough circumstance, more than a little bit of a tough circumstance on our hands here. A moral issue. Christian theologians often claim that moral norms and values both differ from and relate to legal standards and social policies. So, moral values and notions are not immediately the same thing as legal policies and laws. Right? They are related, but they're not exactly the same thing. The legal policies ordinarily in Christian theology land are somewhat more detailed and address specific circumstances than sometimes some of the more general moral stances do. We're going to see how this works a little bit. And the idea in many Christian circles, and it's not a new one, it's from way, way back there, is that in different societies, moral laws and moral values can be institutionalized differently, right? Depending on circumstance. This is not late-breaking news. This is something that even Thomas Aquinas understands, and it's been a while. And it's something that John Calvin understands too. Okay, Thomas Aquinas distinguishes the natural or the moral law that all creatures have access to from civil laws of nations. Now, for Aquinas, the natural law or the moral law is based in the mind of God, right? And then rational creatures have access to it, maybe not complete, maybe not untroubled always, but access to it through reasoning, and that ends up being the natural law or the moral law. In addition to that, in addition to general notions of norms and values that people might have as moral agents, there are civil laws. Civil laws like, no right-hand turn on a red light, which used to be the case here until Ronald Reagan got a hold of it. But in any case, you've got some different laws out there, and they reflect different circumstances. They can be informed by questions of justice and love and so forth, but they're not simply a reduplication of the notions of justice and love. We'll go through this in a little bit with some illustrations. So, the civil laws of nations for Aquinas reflect moral law, but also are responsive to specific social circumstances. John Calvin, Reformation, we move from the 13th century now up to the 16th, says that morality is rooted in conscience and deep sensibilities. This is a notion not unlike Aquinas's, that you have access to deep moral sensibilities. But the deep moral sensibilities are a little general, huh? They are things like fairness, justice, love. All right, let's take fairness. We could have a golden rule: do unto others as and as you'd have done unto you, and so forth. In the case that you're some sort of a sociopath, the golden rule is not very helpful, right? Then you do to others. We do understand that it's a rule of thumb. It's a generalization. It's a good one, but it has limits. And so when you want to ask about in general what's fair, that's a very important question. But it's not yet the same question as exactly how you're going to run school admissions policies in Mecklenburg County, which we hope are fair, but have to be tailored to specific circumstances, that incidentally are not universal. You will be shocked to learn that in the history of humankind, Mecklenburg County has only shown up once or twice. There's one in West Virginia, too. Okay. So, and school systems have not always been set up the same way. So now we have morality rooted in conscience and deep sensibilities, but the sense of equity or justice or fairness, says Calvin, is too general to be a sufficient basis for civil laws and organizing particular societies. For that purpose, the latter then, the civil laws, are articulated in constitutions. Now, constitutions are important, but they're not simply a republication of general moral sensibilities. Constitutions, in turn, he says, are based in the general moral sensibilities like justice and so forth, but they don't simply repeat it. Let's take a kind of example of this. One can say, and a number of Christian theologians do say, that do not steal is a part of a moral law and people mostly know it, okay? It means that it is unfair or unjust to take someone else's possessions, particularly important possessions from them. Do not steal. So do not steal is a feature of the moral law. That's terrific. Now you have in this society also laws against something called insider trading. And that's really interesting. It's apparently a form of stealing. I don't know if I should turn, I don't know if I did this.
No, it's on.
It's on, okay, good. It's a form of stealing, but it's a peculiar form of stealing. In order to have a law against insider trading, you need to have a financial market. And again, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but many societies in the history of the world have not had financial markets sufficient to support a law against insider trading. It's just not there. Okay. Laws in a society that have to do with justice and fairness, like don't steal, don't simply say don't steal. They say a whole bunch of other things, and the other things that they say are related both to the moral norm and to the circumstance, if you have financial markets as we do. Simple enough. I mean, but it's important, see, because when we get to the question of moral, of legal policies eventually, we need to understand that those aren't simply the reduplication of moral values. There's something else also going on, okay? It's important. Now, or again, Calvin says, surely every nation is left free to make such laws as it foresees to be profitable for itself. This is the 16th century, incidentally. The people in the 16th century are not nearly as dumb as a lot of contemporary Americans think they were. And a lot of contemporary Americans probably not quite as bright as they believe they are, but okay. Yet, says Calvin, these must be in conformity to that perpetual rule of love, so that they indeed may vary in form but have the same purpose. So he thinks that social laws and civil laws are meant to hold a society together with common purposes that hold up to be more or less moral. Okay? But how that works, exactly how that's done in different societies, can vary. And we could start talking about things like public school systems, like which incidentally, of course, have not been universal in the history of humankind, and then how to distribute a rare good called education, which has been done differently in different societies and is done differently to the present day. And we could talk about those things, and we could rank the societies if we wanted to and ask whether any of them were completely just. I don't want to, again, be the bearer of bad news. The answer to that question is going to be no. None of them have ever been completely just. But the question is whether they are comparatively just, moral, and can work tolerably just in some sense. Okay, that's Calvin. In his letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. distinguishes between just and unjust laws. He does this in order to point out that you can civilly disobey unjust laws in a certain way, non-violently, so on and so forth. But you need to figure out which ones those are. So the answer to figuring out which ones those are is to ask about what he calls the moral law, or the law of God. So he wants to say that a just law is one that upholds the moral law. The moral law, he thinks, upholds fairness, and it also supports persons, etc. Unjust laws don't. Now, you go to Birmingham, Alabama, and figure out at the time what that means in terms of the different laws and what you might do in terms of civil disobedience. But the distinction that he's making is older than Thomas Aquinas. Okay? And he knows it. He says so in the letter. So we have moral values that are involved in legal arrangements and so forth. For King, to make the distinction between laws that respect and build up persons and unjust laws forms a basis for an ethic of civil disobedience, which is not simply random disobedience, it's targeted disobedience in accordance with some kind of distinction about what's just and unjust. There's more to it than targeting disobedience. There's also the method of how, but this is not a class now in the civil rights movement, but we could go through that as nonviolent resistance is a certain method there. Okay, I'm going to emphasize in the sessions that we have abortion as a moral issue. I will make some connections with various legal policies and proposals, such as Senator Graham's proposal that we just talked about. But I'm not going to articulate one single detailed legal policy. And in fact, it seems to me that from a Christian point of view, constructed in a certain way, a number of different legal policies might pass muster more or less, depending on circumstances, though they will group, as they'll have a kind of family resemblance, I think. And we'll see how they go. But I don't think you're going to get a Christian ethicist to tell you that they definitely know precisely which week and term of pregnancy to cut off access to abortions. I really don't think that Christian theology can get you that quite. We'll talk about that. Christian ethics, then. Christian theological ethics works with a vision or a picture of life and the world before God, before the God disclosed in Jesus Christ. So when you talk about Christian ethics, you're talking about a way of going about things that refers to a certain picture of life in the world. Unsurprisingly, I think it refers to a picture of life in the world in the presence of the God disclosed in Jesus Christ, and then also informed by a variety of other things. This is not everybody's picture of life in the world, as we now know, right? I mean, so there are different pictures of life in the world out here, but we're going to be working primarily with this one. This one is not necessarily simply isolated from all other pictures. It can overlap with them, and it can share certain characteristics, but it's not exactly the same. Huh? So if I start talking about, I don't know, one or another Enlightenment political philosopher or something like that, Rousseau or Kant or something, these are very smart, really. There's overlaps between that and a Christian ethic, but they're not exactly the same. Okay, we'll be all right. And we can talk about other philosophers, perhaps not quite as accomplished as the two I just mentioned, such as Thomas Jefferson. And again, you will see that there are some overlaps, but they're not coterminous. Christian theological ethics works with a vision or picture of life in the world before the God disclosed in Jesus Christ. It also attends to the Bible and subsequent Christian traditions. So it's relevant to ask about different biblical themes and texts in Christian ethics land. This is not something that Rousseau is going to do immediately. He doesn't have to. It's also relevant to ask about what different sorts of Christian thinkers have said about different things. It's also relevant to ask about different worship practices and what they express. Everyone will, I think, not be shocked to learn that the worship service, in fact, does express certain theological sensibilities, and we will talk about that, some other things. It's relevant to ask about different practices of Christian communities at different times. Those are tradition. And then we have biblical themes and texts, and we can ask about all of those things. We can also ask, I think, about other sources of insight, including the sciences and social analyses. What ought to be underscored, and rarely is, I'm afraid, is that you have, or many theologians believe you have, major theological reasons to pay attention to additional sources of insight. Like what? If you run around saying that human beings are, in some respects, good, that they have some abilities and that reason makes a difference, no fair dismissing every reasonable argument made by someone else now. You already said you weren't going to do that. You said that when you said human beings are good and have reason. There's no going back on that. That's a point in creation, as it were. See? Now, you could turn around and you could say, well, what about the sciences? Well, now look, let me just quote Jonathan Edwards for you, a Puritan. Natural philosophy, what passes for him for empirical science, is the study of the manner of God's acting in the world. And he's perhaps a tad direct about that, but on the other hand, you can see why he would say it. If you think this is God's world, then no fair saying the way it's set up counts for nothing when you start making an argument about ethics. Okay? So you have theological reasons, creation and stuff like that, to pay attention to more than just the Bible and Christian tradition, though you also pay attention and your reasons are based in Bible and Christian tradition. Okay? I don't think it's a terribly complicated point, but it's a really important point. So when a Christian ethicist starts trying to take an account of a scientific theory or idea, they may have trouble doing it. They may get the wrong one. That they are doing it is not a peculiar thing. Calvin and Edwards would try the same. Okay? All right, and so would Aquinas. So they're very different times. All right, in a Christian context, so we're going to remain open to other sources of insight, including sciences and social analyses. They are relevant. In a Christian context, let's say to start, that moral norms and ideas have an important but also nuanced place. Moral norms are important, but it's a little nuanced, the place that they have. Moral norms and standards, also moral commitments, are of course associated with God's purposes and will. For example, the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount. And those would be headliners, but there'd be other places to go to. But it's a little hard to say that do not kill doesn't have something to do with a moral norm. I mean, it does. Or love your neighbor, or something like that. We're okay. So we know that in a Christian frame of reference, moral norms and standards are associated with God's will. These are not to be displaced by worship and piety. Now, we could go a number of places there, but maybe one of the more fun places to go is Amos 5, one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s favorite passages, quote, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them, and the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. The general idea there in Amos, as in a number of other prophets, is no fair substituting being holy, right, or praying a lot, for moral norms. You got to do both. They're associated together. So moral norms and values have a very high place in Christian tradition. That is really true, Bible and so forth. On the other hand, as we've just now said, moral law and norms and so forth, though they guide us in a good and faithful life, also have certain ambiguities. And this is in part because Christian theology not only indicates that we should follow moral norms, it also indicates how we should understand ourselves as we try to uphold these norms and values. And this is where we get some complexities and ambiguities. I think right now, probably in this culture, there's a little bit of an outbreak of self-righteousness disease where everyone's decided they can hit all the moral norms and be hunky-dory. You can think that if you want to. Presbyterian tradition obviously does not, which is why you've got a prayer of confession in the service and everyone's supposed to say it, and we'll get to that in a minute. But so what we have here is a notion that moral norms are really important, you should really try hard, and also that there's a certain way in which people live when they're trying to uphold moral norms. Right? And there's certain things they need to know about themselves. Consider that in the New Testament, Jesus radicalizes the moral law. You're perhaps wondering why anyone would think there are ambiguities in trying to fulfill the moral law. Here we go. It's pretty easy to point out. For instance, he links do not murder with do not be angry with a brother or sister. Now let's just think about this for a moment. I lived on Bellevue Avenue in Richmond, Virginia for, 15 years or something. To my knowledge, I never killed any one of my neighbors. I may have done it in my sleep, unconscious, in which case maybe I can get off or something. I don't know, but I never killed any of them. Was I ever angry with them? Maybe sometimes a little bit. Let's go a little further. How about that I always help them? Right? Always help them? I didn't even know half of their names. What do you mean always help them? All right. The point is what? The point is, Otadi breaks for home. Someone throws the ball from left field. It's not even close. He's out at the plate. If you take the moral norms as Jesus radicalizes them, I don't make it home. Very simple. Let's go through some other ones while we're having fun. He presses do not commit adultery to the point of forbidding a man to look at a woman with lust. Quote, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into Gehenna, a valley where corpses are thrown to rot. Okay. So how come I got two eyes? What's going on here? You see, it's a high standard. It's a very high standard. Not only that, some people are going to say it's so high that nobody really quite hits it all the time. This was something, incidentally, that Jimmy Carter got into trouble for admitting when he was running for president, because he was talking to some journalist, said, well, did you ever, disobeyed a command? He goes, yeah, sure, this. And they, oh, really? Yeah, it's sitting in the Sermon on the Mount. Silly, but you got to look out for an American journalist once in a while. They don't always get that. All right, so there he is, and he's perfect on good Christian theological grounds. Then Jesus insists not only that we love our neighbors, but also our enemies in order to be perfect as God is perfect. Good luck with that one. Now, it's a valid moral norm, but it's a radical moral norm, and not everybody hits it all the time, right? Okay. Now, the good news in terms of Christian theology land is that whether or not things work out tolerably well for you in terms of getting to heaven or be saved is not fundamentally a matter of whether or not you uphold the moral law. That's the grace of God. That's another department. See over here, you catch a break. But now that you know you caught a break, you don't have to dumb down the moral law. Well, Jesus didn't really mean that you shouldn't look at a woman with lust. He meant, I don't know, you shouldn't look at bananas. Come on. You've heard enough sermons like that in your life. It's just silly. Now, he does mean that. And he does mean that you're supposed to love your enemies. And just take a look. Again, it remains a valid moral norm, even though you don't always hit it. And you don't have to dissolve into a puddle because your relationship with God does not depend entirely on your own moral performance. Thank you, Jesus. I mean, if it depended on our own moral performance, I don't want to tell you anything. Now, we have some other things. Martin Luther, he of the Reformation, believes that we are unable to uphold the commandment in Exodus 20:17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. It's a problematic little line, isn't it? I mean, it lines up wife with male and female slave, ox, donkey. So try this at my house. You don't see me for again. It's over. It's an old-timey thing, and it's clearly addressed to male heads of household. But do not covet. Is there anything that anyone else has that you ever coveted before? Luther thinks if you are even a part way honest, the answer to that question is yes. So Luther doesn't even think you have to go to the Sermon on the Mount before you understand you got problems here. Okay. We can go further. We have Jesus saying that you should not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink or wear. Do not worry about tomorrow. I didn't bring my whole wallet with me today because, I've decided I can just take my driver's license and a credit card and I can live most of the time, put it in my pocket. But in my wallet, I've got a Medicare card. I've got an insurance card from good old Davidson College here. I didn't bother bringing my retirement account. Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink or wear. Do not worry about tomorrow. Yeah, sure, thank you very much. I don't make it. Be honest. So we've got a radicalized set of standards here, and almost no one makes it through. Paul says, quote, there is no one who is righteous, not even one. Romans 3:10 and following. And then, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, etc., Romans 4. And then there's one that you'll hear in some prayers of confession once in a while, if things are going well, because these things should be in prayers of confession. 1 John chapter 1, verse 8, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us, but Stop New Testament stuff. So, what we want to say then is we also recognize this in worship. Consider calls to confession, prayers of confession, and assurances of pardon. A good prayer of confession does not say, I made a few mistakes this week. That's, you can say that if you want to, and you say whoever you want to. A good prayer of confession says, we've done some bad things and not done some good things, and we are sinners. Those actions come from somewhere, buddy. They didn't just drop out of the sky, they're yours. All right, now that's a good prayer of confession, and it's followed up by an assurance of pardon right away. And also, if it's constructed a certain way, it will tell you that you're confessing these things to the God of grace, which will also be a good thing to know. All right. Again, you don't have to dissolve into a puddle here, but what you can say is that we confess that we not only commit sins, but we are sinners, and we are in need of grace and forgiveness. This is a basic stance. So, one thing we can say, if the moral law guides in a Christian context, and it does, it also accuses. It accuses. And it accuses everyone. There used to be these things, where you could preach somewhere, and at the end, someone that maybe they had a prayer or confession in there, someone come out and say, oh, Pastor, it's a nice service, I enjoyed it, and a prayer confession, I really like that part, I think probably some of them needed to say it, but okay. No. The reason the prayer confession is in there is for everybody. Okay? Now, what can we say here? One of the things we can say is that this sets up a view of moral norms, and also abortion as an issue with conflicting moral values that runs a little bit against the grain of some, not all, contemporary discussions of the issue. We live in an age in which people somewhat frequently assert their own righteousness and condemn others. It's a staple of modern American political discourse. People apparently enjoy this, and apparently the press thinks it sells newspapers and whatever else and electronic things. A basic existential and moral challenge may therefore be lost and obscured. And what's the basic challenge that could be lost or obscured? How shall we live with dirty hands and with the recognition that we are not entirely righteous. That one. That one. That's one of the big questions that comes to you out of Christian tradition with respect to ethics and morality. How shall we live with dirty hands and the recognition that we are not entirely righteous? Now, in a Christian frame of reference, there are a number of things to be said there. One of the first things to be said is grace. Okay, here? We do not want to forget that. Prayer confession is followed by an assurance of pardon. It's possible to underplay a prayer confession. It's possible to overplay it. You need to have grace. You want to talk all these things together now, right? And the worship service does. It does it. So one of the big things is grace. But another thing is humility. Well, humility is important, and what does it mean? It doesn't mean that we become lax or afraid. You're humble, you don't have to be afraid of anybody. Forget that. Just because you're humble doesn't mean you think. All right. It doesn't mean you become lax or afraid. Rather, it means that we should have a sense that all is not right with ourselves, and that we alone have not escaped with complete righteousness. No. It ain't me. I have not escaped with complete righteousness on this issue or many other issues. That's the way it goes. Consider another value, forgiveness. What does it mean? This does not mean never criticizing, never standing up, and never resisting. Martin Luther King Jr. thought that forgiveness was an important moral value. He also engaged in an ethic of nonviolent resistance, right? And he criticized stuff. Okay. Forgiveness means rather the willingness to bear evil in others without vindictiveness, because the evil in the self is known. The willing to bear evil in others without vindictiveness, because the evil in the self is known. Now, this does not mean that you can't resist. This does not mean that you necessarily can't go to war. It means that when you do, you understand that you alone have not escaped with complete righteousness either, buddy. Okay? All right. Now, all of these things may lead us to raise certain basic questions. One, are there instances in which moral values conflict and are not easily upheld and cannot be entirely satisfied? Is it possible sometimes in life that more than one moral value comes into play and they don't simply harmonize? All right. Consider, for example, justice, crime, punishment, and rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is sometimes anchored in a notion of forgiveness and a second chance. But punishment, an appropriate punishment for a crime, is you sometimes ask, does the punishment fit the crime? Well, what is the crime? Whoa, what? Well, what do you think? Can someone always make an untroubled decision about crime, punishment, and rehabilitation? It's, when they start doing this stuff about a judge did this and a judge did that, and I understand judges do some crazy things once in a while, they're people. But it's a little, when the press gets going on this, it's a little bit like shooting fish in a barrel. Who's around who can make those determinations all the time and just make everything harmonized? That's a tough way to go, depending on the crime. Okay? There you go. Or, for example, supporting Ukraine in the current war. A lot of people in this town do. I do. But look. There is the small question of the plight of the Russian foot soldier. These guys didn't frame the policy. They're not Vladimir Putin. Most of them aren't even from towns that have much of an educational system. They're from the provinces somewhere. They get drafted in. They're ill-trained. They show up. Some of them run away. Some of them get it right between the eyes. I support them. I support Ukraine. Is that an entirely untroubled moral stance? Not if I got my eyes open, it isn't. Any more than supporting somebody in almost any war is an entirely untroubled moral stance. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It means you have to calm down about thinking you're entirely righteous when you do. Well, we got Russian conscripts, and those guys, man, they're from whatever stand somewhere, boom, out there like that. They're writing these letters telling why they left their post and all this kind of stuff. Somebody out there somewhere is a Russian foot soldier who's simply been conscripted into an army fighting a bad thing, doing a bad thing, and they can't stop it. Are there moral tragedies, instances in which responsible people must bear some weight of unrighteousness? Are there instances where if you do the responsible thing, you bear some weight of unrighteousness? For example, diplomats and politicians who work to resolve wars in ways that include partitioning of invaded land. Finland in the Winter War from 1939. They get invaded by the then Soviet Union. They fight it out and all this kind of stuff, and they finally end up partitioning parts of Finland. It's not an entirely fair end to the war, but it is an end to the war. What do you think? Think the Finnish diplomats were just immoral you-know-whats to negotiate that solution? Do you think they felt like they had upheld every relevant moral value when they did? Doubt it. Stuff happens in the world, and it could happen in Ukraine, and there are other illustrations of this sort of thing. So my conclusion for today, and it's a preliminary, right? We've got a moral issue with conflicting values. It is an emotionally fraught issue. There are a lot of different positions in the world. People have a tough time working it out. When we approach it from a Christian frame of reference, we want to keep in mind the passionate dimensions of this issue and its personal dimensions. We also want to keep in mind that it's not always possible to optimally satisfy every moral value we got in every determination that we make. And that will be a preliminary down payment on the seriousness of the question before us. Abortion is a difficult moral issue. It's not just a moral issue, it's a difficult one, with reference to which responsible people and communities seem unable to adopt entirely untroubled stances. Our task will be to press forward nevertheless, but hopefully with some measure of humility and grace, since it looks like we're not going to get a simple, untroubled answer to the question. Okay, that's enough of that, and I'll try and we should discuss this stuff and answer any questions. I don't really know that this will all work out. See how it goes, but yes, sir.
Can you conduct an ethical debate between this side that says life and personhood begins at conception, and this side that says, I don't know what those things
We will try to address things like that. Will it satisfy everybody in these debates? And the answer to that question is clearly no, right? I mean, because some of these positions that people take up are pretty hard, and so. But we're going to look at some information about the course of fetal development. We're going to look at some information about fertilization and genetic stuff, and then also other sorts of questions involved here, and ask what sorts of terms to talk about the fetus at different stages in pregnancy look like they make sense. And this is not an exact kind of science to do. It involves correlating values with other sorts of things, and it's difficult to do. I will try to propose some language there that is not simply fetal personhood from point of conception, but is also not simply deciding there's no moral conflict here. There is a moral conflict. So this is going to be part of the tough thing to do. We will, when we go through that, we'll see. I mean, I got stuff from the CDC and from the Cleveland Clinic, to talk about these different points. I think it will become apparent, one, that when you're talking about a fetus and so forth, you're not talking about something that is morally negligible at all. And on the other hand, you're not necessarily talking about what you mean by a person over here, using related, left to the term of pregnancy, you're going to have a certain number of fetuses that become persons, right? All these things are going to be in front of you. We're going to try that. I think the difficulty with a lot of contemporary debate is that the assumption that you can simply make these determinations and that they're not really responsive to some of the ambiguities and the evidences before you. And we're going to try that, but who knows?
I have one other.
Sure.
The Finnish compromise strikes me as utilitarian to some degree. And so the neonatal mortality and maternal mortality as it relates to certain positions and being able to see the correlation between more mothers and babies die under a scenario where this is illegal than when it is. Does that utilitarian ethic enter into this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a utilitarian ethic, one that has to do with consequences, et cetera, and taking into account. I think that most ethics, eventually, in policy land, try to take some consequences into account. I think that a utilitarian ethic, if one presses it and say that's the only thing that counts, one runs into trouble, right? But on the other hand, I think most of the time that is the case. And I think that when people appeal to utility and start talking about those sorts of consequences, they are serious moral appeals. Now, and they need to be weighed, right, together with other appeals, right? It's not easy just to eliminate them. A so-called absolutist ethic sometimes claims that you go with a moral rule or norm apart from asking anything about the consequences. Immanuel Kant has a famous essay on not lying from benevolent motives, right? And the idea is that more or less the police are at the door and they want to get rid of your friends of yours who are upstairs hiding in a room. And they say, "Do you know where your friend is?" And you're supposed to say, "Yeah, he's that's pretty stringent." And for most people involved in a responsibility ethic, that is when you're involved in the push and shove of policy, something like that, an absolutist understanding of moral norm doesn't usually get you all the way home. So it's something to take into account. Max Weber once said that politics is the place where absolute ethics go to die. And it is a pretty interesting remark, I think. Max Weber, a sociologist and philosopher. How are we doing? I don't really know, right? I don't have a complete, Otadi formula to give you the exact thing you should be for politically all the time. I am going to try and run a range of things that I think make some sense, take some of these things into account. When it's done, I will not claim that I have escaped with an entirely untroubled resolution of this issue. There are some issues for which I think I can escape with a less troubled resolution. But this is a particular one, and all issues are.
Well, it's because I think those two things I asked are connected.
Yeah.
Because if you do not think absolutely that you know for certain when life begins, then that justifies a more utilitarian stance. And if you're a hard person on the life begins piece, you're less inclined to take that utilitarian reason.
I think that we do know when life begins. We're not sure when you talk about person. And so what we're talking about here is a developmental sequence where you can talk about nascent human life and life in the beginning that has a genetic sequence determined and all that sort of stuff, which is going to be part of the reason why this is such a difficult issue. It's going to be a question of choice, but it's not going to be a question of choice about choice. It's going to be a question of choice about this. And that's going to make it tough. Yeah.
I think one other thing just on the nature of the fetus when life begins is the reality is not all fetuses are the same.
That's right.
And some are horribly, terribly
Right.
inaccuracies as far as development goes that have no survival potential
Right.
and only suffering.
Right. We will point out also that when you say that you can talk about nascent human life, you're not saying that all fetuses will be brought to term even without any interventions. Right? There are all sorts of things here. And this is some of the information that will be in front of you when you get to try and make a determination about these things. There are going to be some other information in front of you about access to medical care, about circumstances under which women become pregnant, about threats to women, both in terms of physical health and in terms of emotional well-being, things of that sort. But we're going to have all that stuff in front of us, and hopefully we won't gainsay any of it in favor of a slogan or something, and then we're going to see what we got. I do want to emphasize that I do not find my resolution as a happy resolution. Yeah.
Just a little thought off the top of my head to get into politics a little bit. This kind of discussion that we're having in the Presbyterian Church in Davidson, is there any chance that our politicians even think in these terms? It seems they're taking an issue and running with it for their own reasons without really thinking deeply about it.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. I mean, I think there are many politicians out there, and no doubt they think differently about some of these things, and some of them probably have quite profound things that they're thinking. And I think sometimes when this thing gets ginned up to the point of you're coming up to midterm elections, you've got issues and so forth, maybe it is not the most nuanced reflections that are sometimes being put forward. I think there is a big lot of pressure on political groups, particularly in an age of the kind of media we've got, to reduce things to quick slogans and bites, and this is a tough one to do that with, though they certainly have done it, and I think sometimes very much to what their perceived political advantage sometimes. But I do think that there's a lot of politicians out there. I also think that a lot of politicians are under a lot of pressure. Please don't understand me. Yes, I'm not trying to defend all of them. Misunderstand me, not trying to do that. I used to say we should have a Be Kind to Your Local Politician Week, and that week would involve the recognition that sometimes it's pretty tough to decide an issue, and there's a whole bunch of different constituents on it. It would be great if we had towering politicians who thought things through entirely and all stood above the fray and could. But on the other hand, then I think we'd say they're insufficiently responsive to their constituents. I think it's a tough job. And on the other hand, yeah, I do think there are problems with the way political discourse is being run on this issue and some other issues, frankly, in the country. I think it's always plays better politically to rally a base of one sort or another if you can claim that you alone have escaped with complete righteousness and the other side is. But that's not always true. It's not always true. Yeah, so please go ahead.
Can you speak to your standing as a male ethicist and speaking on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a really important thing. I mean, one thing is, I've got colleagues, I think, who would think that a male shouldn't speak to the issue at all. One wants to be very, very careful here. I'm never going to be in the same position, and clearly now, and never would have been in my whole life, in the same position as some women with respect to this issue. I know that. And so we're going to try and be sensitive to emotional and personal dimensions. I'm not going to have immediate personal experience of all that. Now, having said that, an issue like this is situated, right? So are other issues. In the good old days, when I graduated from high school, I graduated into a selective service system that was perfectly willing to send me to Southeast Asia, but wouldn't have drafted you. And when I drafted you, could women at that point talk about the morality or not morality of that war? Well, they would never have been in the same position as, On the other hand, there are mothers, there are sisters, there are wives, there are girlfriends. And so I want to say something analogous to that. I think, yes, women could have judgments about and talk about the morality of, in that case, the war in Vietnam with selective service, et cetera, at that point. And they could make judgments about it and enter into debate. When they did it, would it be important that they reserve and understand that they were not the ones being drafted? Yes. So I think there's an analogous thing here. I do want to be careful about it. If that makes any sense. Tough world out there. All right, thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.
gotta take that. That's the reason. Okay, mic's off.
That still shows sound.
Right, but I mean, well, it might be picking you and I up.